There's a town in America that doesn't appear on any map made before 1967. If you search for it in historical records, you'll find fragments, pieces, whispers in census data that don't match up. And if you ask the oldest residents, those few still alive, they'll tell you they don't remember anything before the fire. But here's the problem: there was no fire, at least not one that anyone reported. Not one that left ashes, just a collective agreement, signed in silence, that everything before a certain date never happened, and the children who were born there, they were taught not to ask. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. This is the story of Stillwater Bend, a town of barely 400 souls tucked into the Appalachian Valley where Kentucky bleeds into Virginia. Drive through it today and you'll see a post office, a diner that closes at 2 in the afternoon, and a church with windows so dark you can't see inside even at noon. Everything looks normal, quiet, forgotten by time in the way small towns often are. But there's something underneath, something the town decided collectively to bury so deep that even their own memories couldn't dig it back up. It started with the children, 20, 3 of them to be exact. All between the ages of 7 and 12, all students at Stillwater Elementary, a red brick building that burned down in 1966, though no fire department has any record of responding to the blaze, and it's centered around a man named Dr. Emil Hartwell, a physician who arrived in town in 1957 with impeccable credentials from a university that, when contacted decades later, claimed no record of his graduation. He was beloved, trusted. Parents brought their sick children to him without hesitation. And for 2 years, everything seemed fine, until the winter of 1959, when something happened during a school assembly that was never written into any official record. No minutes, no photographs, no mention in the local paper. Just 20, 3 children who came home different, and parents who, one by one, stopped asking questions. Dr. Emil Hartwell wasn't from Stillwater Bend, that much everyone agreed on. He arrived on a Tuesday in September 1957, driving a black Chrysler Imperial that looked too expensive for a man claiming to be a rural physician. He rented the old Mercer house on Pinewood Lane, the one with the wraparound porch and the basement no one ever talked about. Within a month he'd set up a practice in the front parlor. Within 2 months he was the only doctor most families in town would see. He had a gentle voice, soft hands. He never raised his fees, even when families couldn't pay. And he took a particular interest in the children. He offered free checkups at the school, vaccinations, vision tests, blood work. The parents were grateful. This was 1957. Remember rural Appalachia, where a doctor making house calls was a godsend. But there were small things, strange things. A mother named Clara Dowell later told her daughter, decades later, in a moment of unguarded clarity, that when her son Tommy came home from one of Dr. Hartwell's visits, he wouldn't stop drawing the same symbol. Over and over, a circle with 7 lines radiating outward, like a child's drawing of the sun, except the lines were uneven, wrong. When she asked him what it meant, Tommy looked at her and said, "The doctor says it's how we remember." Remember what? She never got an answer, because 2 weeks later, Tommy stopped drawing it. In fact, he stopped drawing altogether. Said he didn't like it anymore, couldn't say why. Dr. Hartwell also held evening meetings at the church. Health education seminars, he called them. Parents were encouraged to attend, but children were required. The sessions were held in the basement, a low-ceilinged room with stone walls that stayed cold even in summer. No one remembers exactly what was discussed. Isn't that strange? Dozens of people attended these meetings, week after week, and when you ask them now what Dr. Hartwell talked about, they say things like, "Oh, hygiene, I think," or something about nutrition. But none of them can recall a single specific detail, not one lecture, not one lesson. It's as if those hours simply evaporated from their minds, and then came the assembly, January 14th, 1959, a Wednesday. The school principal, Mr. Vernon Cass, called all students into the gymnasium at 10 in the morning. Parents were not invited. Dr. Hartwell was the guest speaker. The topic, according to a single surviving memo found in a storage box in 2003, was listed as Community Health Initiative. The assembly lasted 90 minutes, and when it was over, 3 children walked out of that gymnasium and never spoke about what happened inside. The parents didn't notice, or maybe they didn't want to. Children are strange creatures anyway. Moody, secretive, lost in worlds adults can't access. But within a week, the changes became impossible to ignore. 10-year-old Sarah Pritchard stopped eating meat. Not because she was upset, not because of taste. She just said it made her feel too awake. Her mother, Ruth, tried to force her to eat a pork chop one evening, and Sarah looked at her with eyes that Ruth would later describe as not my daughter's eyes, and said, "If you make me, I'll remember everything, and you don't want that." Ruth never brought it up again. 12-year-old Jacob Renner started sleepwalking. His father found him one night standing in the backyard, barefoot in the snow, staring at the tree line. When his father shook him awake, Jacob turned and said, "He's still in there. He's waiting for us to forget." Who? His father demanded, but Jacob just blinked, confused, and said he'd been dreaming, except he wasn't asleep. His eyes had been wide open. Then there was the silence. 3 children, all of whom had been normal, talkative kids, suddenly became quiet, not sad, not angry, just distant. They would sit together at lunch, not speaking, just looking at each other as if communicating in a language no one else could hear. Teachers reported it to the principal. The principal reportedly spoke to Dr. Hartwell, and Dr. Hartwell assured everyone it was a phase, psychological adjustment, puberty, stress, nothing to worry about. But the parents worried, of course they did. So a group of them, led by a man named Frank Oller, went to Dr. Hartwell's house one evening in late January to demand answers. "What happened at the assembly? What did you tell our children?" Dr. Hartwell invited them inside, offered them coffee, spoke to them in that calm, soothing voice. And by the time they left an hour later, none of them could quite remember why they'd been so upset. Frank Oller's wife, Diane, said her husband came home that night and told her, "Everything's fine." We overreacted. When she pressed him, he snapped at her, something he never did, and said, "Let it go, Diane, for God's sake, just let it go." She did. Everyone did, and the children continued to change. One by one, they stopped attending church, stopped playing outside, stopped looking their parents in the eye, and the parents, in turn, stopped asking why, because deep down, in a place they refused to name, they were afraid of the answer. March 3rd, 1959. Dr. Emil Hartwell vanished, not dramatically, not violently. He simply stopped being there. His car was gone. His house was empty. The furniture remained, the pictures on the walls, even his medical bag sitting on the kitchen table. But the man himself, gone, no forwarding address, no goodbye. No one saw him leave, and here's the strangest part. No one reported him missing, not the sheriff, not the mayor, not a single patient who'd relied on him for care. It was as if the town collectively decided that acknowledging his absence would be worse than pretending he'd never existed at all. But the children knew. Oh, they knew. That night, several parents reported that their children woke up screaming. Not the usual nightmare screams. These were different, primal, guttural. Sarah Pritchard's mother found her daughter sitting upright in bed, eyes open but unseeing, repeating the same phrase over and over. "He's not gone. He's just waiting. He's just waiting." When Ruth tried to comfort her, Sarah grabbed her mother's wrist so hard it left bruises and whispered, "Don't let me forget, Mama. Please don't let me forget." By morning, Sarah didn't remember saying any of it. None of the children did, but the parents remembered, and it terrified them. In the weeks that followed, strange things began happening. The church basement flooded, even though there'd been no rain. When they drained it, they found symbols carved into the stone floor, the same ones Tommy Dowell had drawn months before. The school gymnasium was condemned after inspectors found structural damage, though the building had been deemed safe just weeks earlier. The damage was localized entirely to the room where the assembly had been held, and people started leaving, not all at once, just a trickle, a family here, a couple there. By the end of 1959, Stillwater Bend's population had dropped by nearly a third. Those who stayed didn't talk about why others had left. They didn't talk about Dr. Hartwell. They didn't talk about the assembly. And when the children, the 23 who'd been in that gymnasium, grew into teenagers, they were different, functional, yes, but hollow, like the best parts of them had been scooped out and replaced with something that knew how to smile at the right times but didn't quite understand why. Some left town as soon as they turned 18. Others stayed, married, had children of their own, but none of them ever spoke about what happened, not to their spouses, not to their children, not even, it seemed, to each other. And their parents, those who remained, began to wonder if maybe the kindest thing Dr. Hartwell had done was make them forget, because the alternative, living with the memory of what they'd allowed to happen, might have destroyed them all. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? 7 years after Dr. Hartwell disappeared, Stillwater Elementary burned to the ground, or at least that's what everyone says. The official story is simple: faulty wiring, old building, tragic but inevitable. The fire supposedly started in the middle of the night, and by morning the school was nothing but ash and twisted metal. No one was inside, no one was hurt. The town mourned the loss of a historic building and moved on, except there's no record of the fire, none. The county fire marshal has no report. The local newspaper, which covered everything from church bake sales to lost dogs, never mentioned it. Insurance companies have no claims filed. And when researchers tried to find photographs of the ruins, they found nothing, not a single image, just memories. Everyone in Stillwater Bend remembers the fire. They remember the smoke, the smell, the way the sky looked orange that night, but none of them actually saw it happen. Isn't that strange? What they did see, according to a handful of testimonies collected by a folklore researcher in 1981, was a coordinated demolition. Bulldozers, construction crews that arrived one weekend and left by Monday. The school was torn down, and in its place they built a new one, smaller, modern, with windows that didn't face the woods. The old basement was filled in with concrete, 6 feet deep, and when asked why the school needed to be demolished so urgently, town officials said it was structurally unsound, contaminated, unsafe for children, but unsafe how, no one would say. The 23 children, now adults in their 20s, watched it happen. Some of them stood at the edge of the construction site, silent as the building came down. A few of them wept, though they couldn't explain why. One of them, a man named Peter Goins, told his wife that night, they're finally burying it. When she asked what he meant, he just shook his head and said, "I don't know, I don't remember." But he did. Somewhere deep inside, he did. After the school was demolished, something shifted in Stillwater Bend. The air felt lighter. People smiled more. The children born after 1966 grew up happy, unburdened. It was as if the town had performed an exorcism on itself. And maybe that's exactly what it was. A collective decision to erase the past, brick by brick, memory by memory, until nothing remained but a vague sense of unease that could be ignored if you didn't look too closely. But the 23 never forgot, Not really. They just learned to live with the weight of something they couldn't name, and when they died, some young, some old, most somewhere in between, they took their secrets with them. Or so the town hoped. In 2009, a woman named Rebecca Cass was cleaning out her late father's attic in Stillwater Bend. Her father, Vernon Cass, had been the principal of Stillwater Elementary during the year's doctor. Hartwell lived in town. He died 2 weeks earlier, and Rebecca, his only child, had returned to settle his estate. In a wooden trunk beneath decades of old tax records and yellowed newspapers, she found a letter. It was addressed to no one, dated March 2nd, 1959, the day before Dr. Hartwell disappeared, and it was written in her father's handwriting. The letter was never meant to be sent. It was a confession. An unburdening of guilt that Vernon Cass had carried for 50 years but never dared to speak aloud. In it, he described the assembly. He described how Dr. Hartwell had gathered the children in the gymnasium and locked the doors. How he'd dimmed the lights and played a recording, something that sounded like music but wasn't, not really. Frequencies that made Vernon's teeth ache even through the closed door. He described how he'd watched through the window as the children sat perfectly still, their eyes wide and unblinking, as Dr. Hartwell walked among them, whispering things Vernon couldn't hear. And he described the moment about an hour in when every single child turned their head in unison to look directly at him, not at the door at him, as if they could see through the wall. Vernon wrote that he ran. He was ashamed of it, but he ran. And when the assembly ended and the children filed out, calm and quiet, he convinced himself he'd imagined it, that it had been a trick of the light, a moment of panic. Nothing more, but he knew he'd always known. Dr. Hartwell had done something to those children, something that couldn't be undone, and Vernon had allowed it to happen because he'd been too afraid to stop it. The letter ended with a single line, "I don't know what he took from them, but I pray to God they never get it back." Rebecca Cass read the letter 3 times, then she burned it. She never told anyone what it said. Not her husband, not her children, not the local historical society that had been begging for documents related to the old school. She burned it in her father's fireplace, watched the paper curl and blacken, and left Stillwater Bend the next day. She never returned. When asked why years later, she would only say, "Some things are meant to stay buried." But the letter existed, and now you know what it said. Stillwater Bend still exists. You can find it on a map now, a tiny dot along Route 23, barely a wide spot in the road. The diner still serves coffee and pie. The church still holds services every Sunday, though attendance has dwindled to a handful of elderly faithful. And the school, the new one built in 1966, still stands. It's a middle school now. The children who attend it have no idea what came before. Their parents don't know either. The town's history, as far as they're concerned, begins in 1967. Anything before that is myth. Rumor, the kind of stories old timers tell to scare outsiders, but every now and then something surfaces. A photograph found in an estate sale showing a building that no longer exists. A name in a census record that no one in town remembers. A grave in the town cemetery with a death date of 1958, belonging to a child who, according to all official records, never existed. And the 23, most of them are dead now. The last of them, a woman named Grace Wilder, passed away in 2018 at the age of 76. She'd never married, never had children, lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, the same house she'd grown up in. In her final weeks, suffering from dementia, she began talking about Dr. Hartwell. The nurses didn't know who she meant, but Grace would smile, a strange, distant smile, and say he's still there in the woods waiting for the ones who remember. When asked what she meant, she'd just close her eyes and hum. A melody no one recognized, a tune that made the nurses uncomfortable in a way they couldn't explain. After Grace died, her house was cleaned out. In her bedroom closet, behind decades of old clothes, they found drawings. Hundreds of them, all the same image, a circle with 7 uneven lines radiating outward. Some were done in pencil, some in crayon, some, disturbingly, appeared to be drawn in blood. And beneath the drawings, carved directly into the wood floor in shaky letters, was a single phrase: "We are the ones who forgot." The house was sold, the floor was sanded down and refinished, the drawings were thrown away. And Stillwater Bend continued on, as it always had, pretending that the past was nothing more than a bad dream. But late at night, when the wind moves through the trees behind the old church, some people say you can still hear it. A melody, faint and wrong, and if you listen too long, you might start to remember things that never happened to you, memories that belong to someone else or something else. The town erased itself from history. But history has a way of clinging to the bones of a place, and some things, no matter how deep you bury them, never really die. They just wait, in the dark, in the silence, in the space between what we remember and what we've forced ourselves to forget. If you made it this far, you're one of the few. Drop a comment, tell us where you're from, and remember, some stories aren't just told. They're passed down, inherited, written into the blood of a place. Stillwater Bend is still there, waiting. Maybe one day someone will ask the right question, and the town will have to decide, once again, whether to remember or to forget. Until then, it remains what it's always been: a town that erased itself from history, and the 23 children who paid the price.